Now we've come over to the VCC, that's the Vehicle Conservation Centre, where the tanks, as you can see, are rather jammed together. It makes it a bit more difficult to do a tank chat, but the trouble is that over in the museum, in the middle of the school holidays, it's very busy, and we can't get the quiet in there that we need to do this. So we've come over here, and hopefully the tanks themselves will be rotated and sent over to the museum later on. They're not here forever, it's only somewhere to store them so that we've got a better display in the museum itself. Now, what I want to show you are two tanks, really, the American T14 and the British A33. And the reason I'm lumping them together is because they were both built to exactly the same purpose. And the idea was to choose which one we'd finish up with in the end. As it happened, we chose neither, but that's neither here nor there at the moment. Now, the first tank we're going to look at is the T14. You'll recognise it's American. It's very Sherman-looking. It's quite an interesting tank. It's quite heavily armoured. It was regarded as an assault tank. It's got armour of a good 100 millimetres thick on the front, on the nose over the transmission, and about 50 millimetres thick on the sloping parts, because being sloping, they can be just that much thinner. And quite an interesting tank. Weighs about 37 tons, the British weight. It's powered by the Ford V8 engine, but it's actually powered by the GAZ or GAZ version, which was more powerful than the ordinary Ford V8 in the Sherman. But it's got the same transmission as the ordinary Sherman in the nose. It carries a crew of 5. You'd have the driver, the machine gunner in the hull front, and 3 more men in the turret. So it's quite a regular tank in that sense. The suspension, which is largely based on the American system, is very Sherman-like. It's double width, actually, so you've got double width of track, but it's using horizontal volute springs, rather like they used in the American T1, the M6 heavy tank, which came out later, or earlier, just to carry the extra weight of this tank, which was a good deal heavier than any Sherman. The tank was designed with British use in mind, which is why they fitted it with these skirting plates. They're not complete on this tank, but you can see the sections of them hanging down here. And the idea was to cover the suspension with armour. As I'll tell you in a minute, it turned out to be a bit of a nuisance, but that's how they did it at the time, to make it more acceptable to a British user. The gun is a 75 millimetre, the same one as in the Sherman, and the turret ring's the same diameter as the Sherman. But the turret itself is slightly different, although it's cast, as you can see. The hull is largely made up of welded plates. They're sloped, 50 millimetres here, and about 100 millimetres on the front where it goes round there, covering the transmission. And as I say, the Ford V8 in the back to push it along. It gave it a respectable top speed of about 25 miles an hour, which isn't bad for a heavy tank like this. Now, the thing is, the reason they had the trouble with this skirting plate was that the tracks kept coming off. While they were trying to sort of test these things, they built 2 of them, in fact, the tracks kept falling off. And the only way to get them back on again was to work on them. And you could only do that by lifting up the skirting plates, which most of the people over there objected to because it was a bit of extra work they didn't need. And that's why you've got skirting plates on, just to look good for the British, really. But it makes it quite an interesting looking tank. So that's T14. It's quite a heavy tank in its own way. And quite a slow, heavily armoured tank, really designed to do the job of what we in Britain would call an infantry tank, although the Americans don't like the term, so they call them assault tanks. We're going to look now at the A33, which is the British equivalent, or rival, if you like, to the American T14. Now, the tank we've got here is Pilot Model B, and it differs slightly from Pilot Model A, which was the one they were actually going to send to America, in the suspension. The original tank, Pilot A, was tested by English Electric, who built the tanks, and it was tested all across country, and they reckon it picked up about 2 tons of mud and a couple of goes at that, and they wore the tank out, so it never went to America. It actually ended up as a hard target. Before that, it was a gate guardian down at Lulworth Camp on the coast. But otherwise, it's just vanished off the face of the earth. And what we've got to show you is Pilot Model B, which was actually, although brought out part of the same family, was intended as a substitute infantry tank in the end. It's at a time when the Churchill wasn't really very popular. And this tank, the suspension is a kind of scissors arrangement, and it was invented by the LMS Railway and Rolls-Royce. But Pilot A, which is the other one, had the American-style suspension with volute springs. And it was rather like the suspension on the American M6 medium, or heavy tank, in fact. And they were the two tanks that were otherwise almost identical. They're powered by the Rolls-Royce 600 horsepower Meteor engine in the back, which is a V12, and that's driving through a Merritt Brown transmission. So in that sense, both vehicles are very much like the Cromwell. And in fact, you can see a lot of Cromwell in the design, in the shape of the turret, in the shape of the hull. The only thing is, this vehicle is much more heavily armoured than Cromwell because it was intended as an assault tank and wasn't just a cruiser as Cromwell was. Now, it's got incredibly thick armour on the front, 114 millimetres on the front, and that was to give it the best resilience possible. They did actually discuss fitting 152 millimetre thick armour to the front, which is the same as you find on the late pattern Churchills. But they decided not to do that in the end. It's got a 75 millimetre gun in a heavily armoured welded turret. It's a 3-man turret, and you've got a 2-man crew in the front, a driver and a hull machine gunner. Although you can see that the actual layout of the tank doesn't allow for a hull machine gun. They never put one in. The other interesting thing about it is that, if you can see it, it has a tiny hatch in the side here, and this was designed for the crew to get in and out of. It works in the same way as the hatch on the side of the Churchill tank, if you like, except that it was very small, and because of that, they didn't like it. It was cramped and uncomfortable to wriggle in and out of in a hurry. But it had a reasonable top speed, but it was fairly heavy. It weighed about 45 tons, and really heavier even than T14. So in that sense, it wasn't probably ideal, but it was all that anyone had thought of as a British answer to an assault tank based on the Cromwell of all things, which seems a strange way to go, but that's the only way they could think of. Now that makes this a very interesting vehicle, and the two of them together, T14 and A33, are really a pair. They sent over a T14 from America for us to test, but by that time, the Americans had completely lost interest in the project, and it died over here as well. A33 wasn't really suitable either, so the whole idea of an assault tank was dropped, and the Churchill, which by this time was beginning to make a name for itself in Tunisia and other places, Italy later on, was taken on as the regular tank for the rest of the war. But for a while, for an interim period, this tank and the T14 were the two they were discussing as a new assault tank to take over from the Churchill. Why they chose the word assault tank instead of infantry tank? Maybe to keep the Americans quiet, because the British were always being hammered for producing a ridiculous thing called an infantry tank, whereas the assault tank, as the Americans called them, which were really the same thing as far as I'm concerned, heavily armoured, slow-moving tanks, was a very acceptable phrase, and that's the only reason they seem to have done it.